Nobody was prepared for the update that came next. Not the longtime supporters. Not the people who had followed the family quietly for years. Not even those who claimed they had already seen it all. When the latest news surfaced, it didn't arrive with clarity or closure. It arrived fractured, emotional, and heavy, leaving behind more questions than answers. For a long time, people believed the worst had already happened. The separation, the investigations, the silence that followed. Many assumed the story had reached its darkest point and that anything afterward would be about rebuilding, healing, reuniting. That belief is what made this update so devastating. The truth is, the family has been living in a state of constant uncertainty. Every day has felt temporary. Every plan has felt fragile. Nothing has stayed still long enough to feel safe. And while the outside world moved on to the next headline, the people at the center of this story remained stuck inside consequences they never asked for. Those close to the situation described the atmosphere as tense but quiet. Not dramatic in the way people online imagine, but heavy in a way that settles into the bones. Conversations are careful now. Words are chosen slowly. There's fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of trusting the wrong person, fear that any step forward could cause 2 steps back. The update that shocked everyone didn't come from a press release or a viral video. It came through fragmented conversations, whispered confirmations, and emotional reactions from people who had hoped for better news. What fans learned was not a single event, but a realization. The path forward is far more complicated than anyone was led to believe. At the center of it all is exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion that doesn't show up on camera. The kind that builds after months of being talked about, analyzed, debated, and judged by strangers. The kind that comes from waiting for answers that never arrive on time. Those closest to the family say the optimism that once existed has faded into something more cautious. Hope hasn't disappeared, but it no longer feels loud or confident. It feels fragile, private, almost guarded. One supporter described it as watching someone brace for impact even when nothing is moving. That's what life has felt like lately. Always waiting for the next call, the next decision, the next change that could undo whatever stability has been managed. What shocked people most wasn't just what changed, but how suddenly it changed. Plans that were spoken about as if they were nearly finalized were quietly altered. Timelines that had been hinted at were no longer mentioned. Expectations shifted without explanation, leaving supporters scrambling to understand what happened behind closed doors. For many, this update felt like a betrayal of hope. Not because anyone intentionally misled them, but because hope itself had been built on assumptions rather than guarantees. People filled in gaps with optimism, believing progress was inevitable. This moment shattered that illusion. The family, however, has been living with this reality for a while. Long before fans felt shocked, they were already adjusting to disappointment. They had learned not to celebrate early, not to speak too confidently, not to trust outcomes that weren't written in ink. What makes this moment particularly painful is the silence surrounding it. There is no clear explanation being offered, no detailed statement, just fragments of information and emotional reactions that suggest something didn't go as planned. That silence has fueled speculation, but those close to the situation urge restraint. They emphasize that this is not about drama or deception. It's about systems moving slowly, decisions being reconsidered, and lives being affected in ways that can't be neatly explained in a post or a video. One thing is clear: the emotional toll is real. The family is grieving possibilities that once felt within reach. Grieving conversations they thought they'd be having by now. Grieving moments that were imagined but never arrived. Supporters who have followed the story for years are struggling too. Many feel helpless, unsure how to support without making things worse. Others feel angry, directing that anger at systems, individuals, or even themselves for believing things would turn out differently. But amid the heartbreak, there is also a quiet truth emerging. The family is still standing, still trying, still showing up to each day despite the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. This update didn't bring closure. It didn't bring resolution. What it brought was reality, messy, painful, and unfinished. A reminder that healing isn't linear, and progress doesn't always move forward in ways that are visible or satisfying. Those closest to the family say the next steps are unclear. Not because no one cares, but because the situation has reached a point where patience matters more than promises. Decisions are being weighed carefully. Outcomes are being considered with long-term consequences in mind. And that may be the hardest part for fans to accept. That wanting something badly doesn't make it happen faster. That love and support, while meaningful, don't override processes that move at their own pace. As this update settles in, one thing remains unchanged. People still care. Deeply. Even when they don't know what to say or do. Even when the news hurts. Even when hope feels distant. This story isn't over. But it's no longer the story people thought they were watching. It's quieter now. More complex. And far more human than any headline could ever capture. If you're still here, still reading, still caring, take a moment to reflect on that. This isn't entertainment. It's real lives unfolding in real time, with consequences that don't disappear when attention fades. Share your thoughts below. Do you think the public ever truly understands the impact of these situations, or does attention sometimes make things harder instead of helping? As the shock settled in, a different emotion began to surface among those who had followed the family for years. Confusion. Not the kind that comes from gossip or rumor, but the kind that grows when the pieces no longer fit together the way they once did. People began asking the same question in different ways. How did things shift so suddenly, and why does it feel like no one is allowed to explain it clearly? For months, the narrative had leaned toward progress. Quiet progress, careful progress, but progress nonetheless. There were hints of movement behind the scenes. Small confirmations that steps were being taken. Enough to keep hope alive without making promises. And then, almost without warning, the tone changed. What fans are only now beginning to understand is that the family has been living in two realities at once. One reality exists in public conversations, where updates are filtered, simplified, and softened. The other exists behind closed doors, where every decision carries weight and consequences ripple outward in ways that can't be predicted. In that private reality, nothing is simple. Every choice affects multiple people. Every delay has a reason that may never be shared publicly. And every step forward requires approval, coordination, and patience that most people are not accustomed to wading through. Those close to the situation say the family was told to prepare for one outcome, only to be informed later that circumstances had changed. No single moment caused the shift. No dramatic confrontation. Just a series of reevaluations that slowly altered the path ahead. That kind of change is difficult under any circumstances. But when your life has already been turned inside out, when stability feels temporary, and when the world is watching, even quietly, it becomes overwhelming. Supporters often underestimate how emotionally draining it is to exist under constant observation. Even when attention is positive, it carries expectations. Expectations to be grateful, to be hopeful, to react the right way, to not express frustration, even when frustration is justified. The family has been careful not to speak out of turn, not to contradict official processes, not to inflame speculation, but silence comes at a cost. In the absence of clear explanations, people fill in the gaps with assumptions. Some assume the worst. Others assume blame lies somewhere specific. And while those assumptions may make sense emotionally, they don't reflect the complexity of what's actually happening. One person close to the situation described it as waiting in a hallway with no clock. You don't know how long you'll be there. You don't know what door will open. You just know you're not allowed to leave. That feeling has defined the past several months. Waiting without timelines. Hoping without certainty. Adjusting expectations repeatedly to avoid disappointment, only to be disappointed anyway. What has broken hearts most is not just the delay, but the emotional cost of preparing for something that doesn't happen. Every time plans are discussed, even tentatively, the mind runs ahead. Imagines conversations. Imagines reunions. Imagines relief. When those imagined moments are taken away, the grief is real, even if the event never officially occurred. Fans are feeling that grief now, but the family has been carrying it quietly for a long time. Each shift has required them to reset emotionally, to remind themselves not to celebrate early, to stay grounded in the present rather than reaching for a future that feels just out of reach. The update that left fans heartbroken wasn't just about what didn't happen. It was about the realization that there is no guaranteed timeline for when things will change, that the story may continue unfolding slowly, painfully, and without the kind of resolution people crave. Some supporters have expressed anger toward the system, others toward individuals they believe played a role. But those closest to the family caution against narrowing blame too quickly. They say the truth is less about villains and more about a process that does not bend easily to emotion or urgency. That doesn't make the pain easier to accept. It just explains why it exists. In the midst of all this, the family continues to do what they've always done, survive. Not with dramatic gestures, but with routine. With small moments of normalcy. With quiet resilience that doesn't translate well to updates or headlines. They wake up. They get through the day. They wait. They hope carefully. Supporters who have reached out privately say the family is tired, but not defeated. Hurt, but not without faith. They are learning how to hold hope without letting it break them. This is where many fans are struggling now. How to stay supportive without demanding answers that may not be shareable. How to care without adding pressure. How to sit with discomfort instead of trying to solve it. The reality is, there may not be a satisfying explanation anytime soon. The situation may remain unresolved longer than anyone wants. And that uncertainty is part of the heartbreak. But there is also something important happening beneath the surface. The family is being seen as people, not symbols. Their lives are being handled with caution rather than spectacle. And while that means fewer updates and less clarity, it may also mean fewer irreversible mistakes. Sometimes, the kindest thing is not the fastest thing. That's a hard truth for an audience accustomed to instant answers. But it's one the family has had to accept out of necessity. As supporters, the challenge now is to decide what kind of presence we want to be in this story. One that demands, speculates, and pressures? Or one that waits, listens, and respects the silence when silence is all that can be offered? The heartbreak is real. The shock is understandable. But the story is still unfolding, and the people at its center are still living it day by day. Take a moment to reflect before reacting. Sometimes support isn't loud. Sometimes it's patient. Share your thoughts below. How do you balance wanting answers with respecting the process when real lives are involved? As days passed after the update, another layer of the situation began to surface, not through announcements or statements, but through absence. Fewer messages. Fewer indirect confirmations. A noticeable quiet that felt heavier than any bad news could have. For many who had followed closely, that silence was unsettling. It suggested not peace, but caution. Those closest to the family described this period as one of emotional retreat. Not because they stopped caring, but because they were overwhelmed by caring too much. When every word can be dissected, misinterpreted, or weaponized, silence becomes a form of protection. Behind the scenes, emotions have been running high. Hope hasn't disappeared, but it has changed shape. It's no longer loud or eager. It's careful, guarded, almost fragile. The kind of hope that stays hidden so it can't be crushed again. One supporter described it as learning not to look forward too far. Another said it felt like standing on uneven ground, where celebrating even small progress feels risky. This emotional recalibration hasn't been easy, especially for people who have already endured instability most of their lives. What many fans don't realize is how much emotional labor goes into simply waiting. Waiting without updates. Waiting without reassurance. Waiting while knowing that others are discussing your life as if it were a storyline rather than a lived experience. For the family, each day now carries a quiet tension. Not panic, but vigilance. Listening for news. Watching for changes. Measuring every interaction carefully. Even positive attention can feel overwhelming when you're already emotionally exhausted. The heartbreak fans feel is valid, but it's only a fraction of what's happening internally. The family has had to grieve possibilities that once felt close enough to touch. Plans were not just postponed. They were emotionally processed, mentally rehearsed, and then taken away. That kind of loss doesn't leave visible scars, but it lingers. Some fans have asked why the family doesn't speak more openly, why they don't clarify, defend themselves, or correct narratives that feel unfair. The answer is complicated. Speaking can help, but it can also complicate matters. When systems are involved, when outcomes depend on discretion, silence can be strategic. That doesn't mean it's easy. There's also a growing awareness that some expectations placed on the family were never realistic to begin with. Expectations shaped by viral moments rather than long-term realities. Expectations that assumed resolution would be quick, clear, and satisfying. Real life rarely works that way. What's happening now is less dramatic, but more important. The family is learning how to exist without leaning on promises that may not materialize. They are grounding themselves in what they can control: daily routines, personal connections, small comforts. That doesn't erase the pain. It just makes it manageable. Supporters who have remained patient say they've noticed a shift in tone when they do hear from the family. Less anticipation, more reflection. A kind of weary honesty that doesn't ask for pity, only understanding. This phase of the story isn't about breakthroughs. It's about endurance. And endurance doesn't look inspiring in real time. It looks quiet. It looks repetitive. It looks like people getting through the day without falling apart. That's hard to rally around. Hard to celebrate. Hard to turn into content. But it's real. Some fans are struggling with that reality. They want closure. They want justice. They want answers. And those desires come from a place of care. But pushing for resolution before it's possible can do more harm than good. There's also been a noticeable shift in how longtime supporters talk about the situation. Less speculation. More empathy. Less urgency. More patience. It's as if the heartbreak forced a collective pause, a moment to reassess what support actually looks like. True support isn't demanding updates. It isn't filling silence with assumptions. It's holding space for uncertainty without making it worse. The family has expressed gratitude for those who understand that, for those who don't pressure them to perform resilience or gratitude. For those who allow them to be human in a moment that feels anything but stable. And yet, even with that understanding, the ache remains. The update that shocked fans didn't just change expectations, it changed trust. Not in people, necessarily, but in outcomes. The belief that things work out eventually has been replaced with a more cautious mindset. Things might work out, but not in the way or time frame anyone expects. That realization is sobering. Still, there is resilience here. Not the kind that gets shared in inspirational quotes, but the kind that keeps people going when optimism runs dry. The kind that says, "I'll get through today," without worrying about next month. For the family, that's enough right now. They are not giving up. They are regrouping. And there's a difference. As this chapter continues, supporters are being asked, implicitly, not explicitly, to adjust how they engage, to resist the urge to fix, to resist the temptation to speculate, to simply care without conditions. That may be the hardest ask of all. But stories like this don't resolve on command. They unfold slowly, often painfully, and always imperfectly. The heartbreak fans feel is part of that process, but it doesn't have to define it. If there's one thing this update has made clear, it's that the family needs time more than anything else. Time to heal. Time to adapt. Time to see what doors, if any, will open next. And sometimes, the most meaningful support is the kind that doesn't demand anything in return. If you're still here, still reading, still caring, share your thoughts below. How do you continue supporting someone when the outcome is uncertain and the waiting feels endless? As the days stretch on, something subtle but significant has begun to happen among those still paying attention. The shock has faded, and what remains is a deeper, quieter form of concern. Not the loud kind that demands answers, but the heavy kind that sits with unanswered questions and refuses to turn away. For the family, this phase has been about recalibration. Life did not pause simply because plans changed. Bills still exist. Appointments still matter. Emotions still fluctuate without warning. The difference now is that everything feels more fragile. Like one wrong step could undo what little stability remains. People often underestimate how exhausting uncertainty can be. It drains energy in ways that visible crises do not. There's no single moment to react to, no clear problem to solve. Just a constant low-level tension that never fully leaves the room. That's where the family is now. They wake up each morning not knowing what the day will bring, but knowing it probably won't bring clarity. That alone is enough to wear someone down. Even optimism becomes tiring when it has nowhere to land. There has been grief in this period, though not the kind people usually recognize. It's grief for expectations. For timelines that no longer apply. For versions of the future that quietly disappeared without ceremony. And grief like that doesn't announce itself. It shows up in smaller ways: fatigue, hesitation, withdrawal. The family hasn't stopped caring. They've stopped projecting certainty they don't feel. Some supporters have mistaken that for distance. Others have assumed the worst. But those closest understand what's really happening. This is a family conserving emotional energy because they've learned the cost of hope when it's placed too far ahead. What's heartbreaking is that the disappointment wasn't caused by inaction or indifference. It was caused by believing too early that things were finally turning around. That belief, once broken, leaves a scar that makes future hope more cautious. There's also an unspoken pressure the family carries, knowing how many people are emotionally invested in their outcome. That kind of attention can feel like support, but it can also feel like responsibility. Like failing isn't just personal but public. No one should have to carry that. The truth is, the family didn't do anything wrong. Life simply didn't move in the direction people expected. And when expectations are built collectively, disappointment spreads wider and hits harder. Fans who feel heartbroken are responding to that shared letdown. But the family is living inside it. In private conversations, those close to them describe a mix of gratitude and weariness. Gratitude for the kindness that still exists. Weariness from having to process their reality while others debate it from afar. There's also a growing awareness that not every story has a clean resolution. Some unfold slowly. Some stall. Some change shape entirely. And accepting that doesn't mean giving up, it means adapting. The family has begun doing just that. Rather than focusing on what didn't happen, they're narrowing their focus to what still can. Daily routines have become anchors. Familiar habits provide comfort. Small moments, shared meals, quiet evenings, simple conversations, matter more now than big promises ever did. This shift isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like progress in the traditional sense. But it's survival, and survival deserves respect. Supporters who understand this have changed how they show up. Fewer demands. More patience. Less advice. More listening. It's not about fixing the situation anymore. It's about not making it heavier. That change has been noticed, even if it hasn't been publicly acknowledged. The family knows who has stayed without conditions. Who hasn't disappeared just because the story got complicated. Who didn't need constant updates to remain compassionate. That kind of loyalty matters more than words. There's also a lesson emerging here, though it's an uncomfortable one. Caring about people doesn't entitle us to outcomes. Following someone's journey doesn't mean we control its direction. This story was never meant to be inspirational entertainment. It was always real life, unfolding under a microscope. And real life resists neat conclusions. As fans process that reality, some are choosing to step back, not out of indifference, but out of respect. Others are staying quietly without expectations. Both responses are valid. What isn't helpful is pressure. Pressure to explain. Pressure to reassure. Pressure to perform resilience for public comfort. The family has already given more than enough of themselves. Right now, they don't need cheerleaders or critics. They need space. Space to feel disappointed without being told to stay positive. Space to be tired without being labeled ungrateful. Space to exist without being turned into a lesson. And yet, even in this quiet phase, there is something steady holding everything together: connection. Not the viral kind. The human kind. People checking in privately. Messages that don't ask for answers. Support that doesn't need acknowledgement. These things matter more than trending conversations ever did. The heartbreak fans feel hasn't gone unnoticed. It's just being felt differently on the inside. There is no big announcement coming right now. No sudden reversal. No dramatic update waiting around the corner. That's hard to accept, but it's honest. Sometimes the most truthful update is that nothing has changed, except the people involved have grown more careful with their hearts. And that, in itself, is a kind of progress. The story isn't over, but it's in a quieter chapter, one that won't reward impatience or speculation, one that asks for empathy without guarantees. For those willing to offer that, your presence still matters. And for those struggling with the heartbreak of it all, know this: caring deeply doesn't mean you were wrong to hope. It just means you're human. If you've stayed through this part of the journey, share your thoughts below. How do you personally cope when hope doesn't disappear, but has to change? Time has a way of revealing what noise once hid. As the weeks passed after the last update, what shocked people most was not a new event, but the absence of one. No dramatic turn. No miracle fix. No villain exposed. Just the slow realization that this story was never going to follow the arc many expected. For the family, that realization came quietly. There was no meeting where it was said out loud. No announcement. Just a shared understanding that life had shifted into a different gear, one that required patience instead of urgency, endurance instead of anticipation. The heartbreak fans felt did not vanish. It matured. At first, supporters waited. Then they worried. Then some grew angry. And finally, many grew quiet. That quiet wasn't abandonment. It was acceptance. The hardest kind. Inside the family, conversations change tone. Less, when this happens, And more, what can we do today? That shift didn't mean giving up on the future. It meant refusing to let the future steal the present. Hope became smaller, but sturdier. Instead of hoping for sweeping change, they began hoping for manageable things. A good day, a calm night, a productive appointment, a moment of peace without interruption. These hopes were modest, but they were reachable, and that mattered. One of the most painful parts of this chapter has been watching people misinterpret that adjustment. Some assumed silence meant secrecy. Others assumed exhaustion meant guilt. A few even assumed gratitude had disappeared. None of that was true. What disappeared was the ability to perform optimism on demand. There's a difference between being hopeful and being expected to reassure others. The family learned that distinction the hard way. They had spent so long being observed, discussed, and interpreted that it became necessary to reclaim something private, emotional truth. They stopped explaining themselves. That decision wasn't made to punish supporters. It was made to protect what little emotional reserve they had left. You cannot heal while constantly narrating your pain for public consumption. Those who truly cared understood this without being told. There were moments of guilt, especially for Betty. She worried that people felt let down, that the faith others placed in her story had been misplaced. That silence might feel like ingratitude, but those closest to her reassured her of something important. Survival is not a performance. No one is owed access to someone else's endurance. That reassurance mattered more than any public defense. The weight Betty carries now is different than before. It's not just about loss or disappointment, it's about responsibility. Responsibility to herself, to her family, and to the fragile stability they're rebuilding piece by piece. And stability, in this context, doesn't look impressive. It looks like routines being followed even when motivation is low. It looks like showing up to obligations without knowing the outcome. It looks like choosing rest over explanations. It looks like living quietly. For fans, that quiet has been unsettling. We're conditioned to equate visibility with progress. When updates slow down, people assume things are getting worse. But sometimes, quiet means things are finally being handled where they belong, away from the spotlight. The family has not disappeared. They have not turned away from those who care. They have simply stopped inviting chaos into already fragile spaces. This has led to a natural thinning of attention. Some people left because the story no longer fed their curiosity. Others stayed but learned to observe with less entitlement. A smaller group remained steady, offering support without conditions. That group has become invaluable. These are the people who send messages without questions, who offer help without instructions, who understand that compassion doesn't require updates. And the family feels that difference deeply. There is still pain here. Anyone who says otherwise is romanticizing struggle. There are days when disappointment resurfaces unexpectedly. Days when plans that never happened still sting. Days when uncertainty feels heavier than it should. But there are also days when laughter returns without guilt. Days when memories don't hurt as much. Days when the future feels distant, but not hostile. Those days matter. One of the hardest truths fans have had to confront is this. You can care deeply about a story and still not get closure. Real lives don't tie themselves up neatly. This one won't. There will be no single moment where everything makes sense. No final explanation that satisfies every question. No resolution that feels proportional to the attention this story received. And that's okay. Because closure isn't something the audience receives. It's something the people living the story slowly create for themselves. The family is doing that now, quietly, imperfectly, and without an audience. They are learning how to hold disappointment without letting it define them. How to accept support without becoming dependent on it. How to exist without constantly being interpreted. That is not failure. That is growth. Fans who feel heartbroken are not wrong to feel that way. It means you connected. It means you hoped. It means you cared. But the most loving thing now is to let the story breathe. To allow space for healing that doesn't need validation. To trust that people can rebuild without narrating every step. To understand that stepping back can be an act of respect, not disinterest. This chapter isn't loud. It isn't viral. It isn't dramatic. It's real. And real life, more often than not, moves forward quietly. The family has not lost everything, but they have lost illusions. And in their place, they're building something sturdier. Acceptance, boundaries, and resilience that doesn't depend on applause. If there is a lesson here, it isn't about blame or heroes or villains. It's about the cost of public hope, and the courage it takes to keep going when that hope changes shape. The story continues, not as entertainment, but as life. If you're still here, thank you for caring without demanding. If this update left you emotional, you're not alone. Share your thoughts below. How do you personally let go of expectations while still holding on to compassion? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.